Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is senior editor Dan Alexander. Dan, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You reported that Trump's net worth has taken a hit since last fall, and that has a lot to do with his social media network, Truth Social. But let's start from the beginning here. Can you paint a picture of what his net worth looks like starting when Forbes first started tracking it?
Oh gosh, so we're going back to 1982 now, and this is the first year of the Forbes 400. Donald Trump appeared with a shared fortune alongside his father. We put each of them at $100 million. Now, at the time, Donald Trump was lying to us about what percentage of his father's fortune he actually owned. So he really shouldn't have been on the list at all at the start. His true net worth at the time was closer to zero. It was probably like $5 million or something like that. But nonetheless, we put him on at 100. And over the years, it started to grow and grow. So by the time you get to 1990, this is really the big crash of Donald Trump. So he's now, with his father's help, built up a couple of decent projects in Manhattan and decided to go do big ventures in Atlantic City. And those blew up. He also decided to buy the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, buy a New Jersey professional football team, buy a yacht. He basically went nuts, spending a bunch of money that he didn't have. And it all came crashing down. So at one point, Donald Trump was worth probably less than zero, but he managed to keep hold of his fortune. And he ended up coming back on, I think that the year that he returned was 1996, if I'm not mistaken. And he sort of slowly crept up and up and up. The highest point that we ever had him was just before he launched his campaign for the presidency. We had him at $4.5 billion. Then once he becomes president, his opening net worth when he's in office is $3.5 billion, sort of the starting point of this big experiment of what's going to happen to a multi-billion-dollar fortune when you bring it into the White House. And what we saw was not good for Donald Trump. Politics is polarizing. This is a guy who has some businesses that are consumer facing. I'm talking mostly about hotels, but also some of his licensing ventures. And all of that stuff was crushed. It's not good to run a hotel when 50% of people aren't going to want to go there. And if you're throwing a conference, sure, you can get some political events, but imagine you're a big business conference. You're probably not going to choose to put it at Trump's place when you could be turning off some of the people that you're inviting. So a lot of his businesses really suffered during the presidency. It took him down to about $3.1 billion. Remained flat there, although certain assets were going up and down, but the overall picture remained at about 3.1 until COVID hit. Obviously, bad news for people who own commercial real estate. Initially, hotels were really hard hit. Same with retail shops. Nobody's shopping on Fifth Avenue. Nobody's staying in expensive hotels. But over time, those businesses started to come back. Now you've got the overhang of office space, which fortunately for Trump, his tenants continue to pay rent for the most part during COVID. But now you've got leases coming up. And the question is, do people want as much space? And is there going to be an oversupply of office space? So that's really hurt Donald Trump more recently. So his fortune goes first to 2.1 billion in the very shock of COVID when it first happened, starts to come back to about 2.5 billion as the economy recovers and things start to stabilize a little bit more. And then he creates this social media network through social. And although it starts as just an idea, people think it's a fantastic idea. And that boosts his fortune up to about $3.2 billion at the outset. And now True Social and the Trump Media and Technology Group has come crashing down. And so his fortune, now we have it, $2.5 billion. There you go. There's a 40-year history in a couple of minutes.
I really appreciate it. What you just painted was a decades of peaks and valleys, highs and lows when it comes to Donald Trump's net worth. You mentioned at one point his net worth could have been below zero, but how was he able to keep his fortune there? And how was he able to rebound into what many see as a very successful businessman?
Yeah, one of the things that he did best, and I think has served him as sort of a blueprint for when he's faced challenges the rest of his life, is in the 1990s when his creditors all needed money to they weren't going to get, he fought like you wouldn't believe, and struck this series of deals that basically kept him hanging around, and relegated his problems to what was going on in Atlantic City rather than infecting his entire empire. Now, there were some parts that seeped out. He lost the Plaza Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, for instance. He had to get rid of his yacht, that sort of thing. But he kept some of his core assets in Manhattan. So the property that ultimately was traded to become 1290 Avenue of the Americas and 555 California Street, that he kept. He kept Trump Tower. He kept 40 Wall Street. So as these other things were going down to zero and below, and Trump was forcing the problems upon his creditors first, and then ultimately upon the public markets. He took his casino empire public, and a bunch of shareholders really got hosed, believing in Donald Trump, ultimately declared bankruptcy multiple times, but kept it segregated from some of his core Manhattan assets. And so as all that stuff was collapsing, the Manhattan stuff was gradually rising, and that's how he was able to come back.
Dan, something that I just wrote down that you've said in multiple conversations with me is that people who believed in Donald Trump got hosed. Why is this such a common theme throughout the decades of his life as a businessman, as a president, and now back into being in the businessman's sphere?
Yeah, it's something about Trump. He is a very charismatic guy, who people want to be around him. People are attracted to him. And that goes back to the early 1980s. Yes, he had his dad as a backstop, but nonetheless, he convinced some of the most savvy lenders in the world to give him tons of money for projects in Manhattan and later in Atlantic City. They got crushed. Many bankruptcies and many losses for those people. Then you have him, go and do these licensing ventures where he's basically putting his name on other properties and not taking any risk himself. Some of those were successful, especially for Donald Trump. Many of them failed. People who bought into, the Trump project in Baja California, for instance, bought in believing that they were investing alongside Trump. Well, they actually weren't. It was just Trump's name, and the project fell apart and they lost a lot of money. Then you go, of course, to his presidency. You have tons and tons of people putting enormous faith in Donald Trump. You can sort of paint whatever you want him to be. You can imagine him to be, and he wins the election, and very quickly, his approval ratings dive, and he gets mired in controversy, and ultimately becomes a one-term president. So over and over again, you've had all of these instances. And then just recently, he goes back to the public markets by trying to take his social media business public via this SPAC. And tons of people who really love Donald Trump say, this is my opportunity. I'm going to invest alongside Donald Trump. And they buy shares of the SPAC, hoping that it will ultimately merge with Trump's company, and they'll own a piece of Trump's empire. And those shares have collapsed from a high of $175, and now they're trading around $14. So people who invested at the absolute peak, and it's a sad story. These are people who really believed in Trump and wanted to be invested alongside him. Many of them lost 90% or more of their money so far, and this thing could go down even further.
You've reported he lost somewhere in the neighborhood of, I believe, $700 million in Truth Social within the past few months. But you also mentioned he's had a graveyard of failed business ventures like Trump Steaks, Trump University, and GoTrump.com. Did he lose a substantial amount of money with those as well?
Those ones, no, because those were mostly licensing ventures. So that's sort of the no risk approach. I'm going to say to a company, hey, I'm going to make your steaks or whatever a branded steak, and somehow people are going to buy a bunch more of this. And so the company pays him a fee in order for him to put his name on it. But he doesn't really have to do much work. I mean, sure, he sends a few lawyers to sign contracts and that sort of stuff. But it's not like he's out there slaughtering cows and making them into steaks. He's just putting his name on the thing. And so ultimately, when those businesses went belly up, the people who were left holding the bag were the companies that wanted to brand their thing with Trump, not Trump himself. He gets less in fees, but doesn't really have huge losses from those ventures. Certainly, there are others in which he has had big losses. For example, in Atlantic City in the Trump Plaza or the Plaza Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. So he's had his share of up and downs for sure.
He started as a real estate mogul, obviously. He then transcended in this tabloid celebrity. He was the host of The Apprentice. Did this celebrity figure of Donald Trump help his net worth?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, The Apprentice was huge for him because remember, after those initial bankruptcies, banks were much more cautious about lending to Donald Trump. The idea that he couldn't get loans from anywhere is not true. He did get lots and lots of money, even after those early bankruptcies. But he was having trouble getting loans from sort of the A-list companies. And, the ones that would be willing to lend to him might be willing to lend to him only at slightly higher interest rates. So as he's having trouble getting financing, what he does is he goes on television and he becomes a TV star. And that is a huge financing tool, essentially, that puts hundreds of millions of dollars of pure cash. He doesn't have to take loans out to get it into his business, which allows him to expand into other ventures, for example, his golf and clubs business.
Now his net worth today is Forbes estimates it at $2.5 billion. Can you break down what assets make up that fortune?
Yeah, so in total, he has about 30 assets. If you look sort of by categories, New York City real estate is roughly $750 million of that. This is all after debt that I'm counting. Truth Social and his licensing ventures, you've got about $200 million there. Non-New York City real estate, so this would be like his hotel condo in Las Vegas or the tower that he owns part of in Chicago. Those are another, call it $225 million, something like that. And then he has basically a big collection of golf courses and clubs. So this includes Mar-a-Lago, but it's also, 10 different courses around the country. That adds up to, at this point, somewhere between $700 and $750 million. And finally, he has sort of the rich guy lifestyle stuff. So we'll count cash in this, which at this point we estimate at $425 million, much more liquid than he's been in recent years. That's largely due to refinancing an office tower in San Francisco and selling his hotel in Washington, D.C. But then he also has a bunch of mansions, a mansion in Bedford, New York, another one in St. Martin. Of course, he's got the penthouse at Trump Tower. He has 3 homes right alongside Mar-a-Lago. So all these sort of things that don't necessarily bring in a ton of money, but nonetheless are worth a lot of money.
As you mentioned before, he's a polarizing figure. He continues to be a polarizing figure by being in 2024 again. He just got indicted. Will these continued events impact his net worth? You mentioned that it's not good to be polarizing if you own hotels.
Yeah, certainly I think that it's unlikely that Donald Trump becomes more polarizing in the future than he already has been and than he is right now. I think sort of that damage is done. The things that you have to look out for now are his abilities to expand. So, for instance, when Donald Trump signed some of his lending agreements for the DC hotel, for his tower in Chicago, and for a resort that he bought down in Miami, as part of those lending agreements, he had to tell Deutsche Bank, who was his lender at the time, that he had not been indicted or convicted of a crime. He could no longer tell a bank that. So you have the question of whether this is going to impact his ability to get financing at standard rates. I do think that he will be able to borrow money. He's got valuable assets. And time again, he's shown that there are always lenders. They might not be the A-list lenders, but then you go to the Bs, then the Cs, then the Ds, and eventually somebody will lend to you. The trick there is that you, in doing so, might have to pay a higher interest rate, which cuts into your profitability and the amount of cash that you can take out. I don't think that Donald Trump is going away, but I also don't see his fortune going through a big growth spurt really for the rest of his life. But you never know with Donald Trump. I mean, he could come up with something. He almost did with Truth Social. It just seems to be petering out.
You've reported that investors were initially excited over the news of his indictment. Do you think this excitement will be short-lived, or will that have some life and some legs?
I do think that it will be short-lived. You've seen over time as various news events have happened. For instance, when Donald Trump announced that he was running for president, saw shares of the DWAC, the SPAC that's going to merge with Trump's company that oversees Truth Social. you saw shares spike at that point. And then what tends to happen is they spike really dramatically, and then they sort of peter out over time, and they get back to baseline and even travel down below it. And that's really been happening since this SPAC that's going to merge with Trump's company has been trading publicly, all the way from the first spike when it went to 175, and it went way down and then a little bit up and then way down, and just sort of news events send it spiking back up. But ultimately, you get to what are the fundamentals of the business, and the fundamentals of that business are not strong.
Dan Alexander, thank you so much.
Thank you.